Thank you so much for being here and welcome to The Secret to Classroom Engagement. Everyone has a voice. So one thing we want our graduate to be able to do is to communicate well, to learn to communicate well. In addition to interacting with the content material, students need to interact with one another and with you, the instructor of the course. Studies show that instructional approaches that use student interaction are more likely to enhance student learning. Um, Turn on closed captioning. Let me see. Can you see the transcript?
I don't see it, but it might be on the recording.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can't. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Yes.
Okay, I can't see any captioning, and I'm not sure. I'm not familiar with Teams because it's not super accessible, and so
Mhm.
I don't know if there's
Oh,
something I need to do on my end.
Would
I
you,
see, Lynn.
is it
Yeah,
help?
if you click on the more
Oh,
buttons, the three buttons there, and you can
yeah.
go down and you can do the turn on transcript. Um,
Turn on transcript. Where is
yeah,
that?
and
Oh,
so then if
record
you
and
do that, the
transcribe.
transcript shows up on the side where the chat is.
I see. Okay, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Okay. Thank you. So like I don't know how much of my screen you see, but did you find it? But did you find the transcript?
Yep, looks like we have it.
Okay, perfect. All right. So today, we will explore some evidence based strategy to support equitable classroom participation and engagement. And I do hope that everybody going to share your experience. What have you tried in your classroom? How is it working out for you? Like I mentioned to Kathy earlier, this is the space where I can present you with some evidence based strategy, but it's also create a space for faculty learning community so that you guys can learn from one another. So my name is Lynn Nguyen. My pronoun is she, her. I am an inclusive teaching coordinator at the Center for Innovative Teaching and Learning. I have taught chemistry at NIU since 2016. And in June 2023, I joined the Center for Innovative Teaching and Learning and started a new career in educational developer. Although I'm new to this field, educational development, I have over a decade of teaching experience in higher education at various institutions, including NIU, and I'm very excited to have you here with me to discuss fostering equitable classroom engagement and communication skill for our students to better prepare them for the diverse workplace. So thank you for being here. So now I would like to ask everybody to share with the group here since we're going to spend the next 60 minutes of our life together. So let's find out about how diverse we are in terms of our disciplines and expertise. So please tell us your discipline and what brought you here today. What do you hope to get out of the workshop? You can join in various ways. You could unmute yourself and talk. You could type in the chat, and I budget a couple minutes for us to do this.
I'm happy to hop in and start, Lynn. So,
Yes, thank you.
um, of course. So my name is Kathy Zeke. I teach English. I'm also a graduate of NIU. In English, I teach everything from beginning composition to the other end. So this time I have students who are seniors and I'm teaching them the career preparation for English majors. I teach tech writing, tech editing, and and that's sort of stuff at that end. And I'm here because I love these workshops for always kind of reminding me of what the essential things are and reminding me of those strategies and helping me keep me at the forefront, as well as getting ideas from other people,
Thank you, Kathy, and
of course.
so happy to have you here. In the chat, we have Ari say associate professor in political science, and then we also have Alicia. Ari, you want to say a little bit more?
Sure. I think similar sentiment to what Alicia has in the chat and what Kathy just said as well. I like attending these seminars to learn some best practices, and this one sounded particularly interesting because trying to up levels of engagement in person and online in courses is a challenge, and I'm always looking to share ideas and practices with folks who have had success.
Thank you, and welcome. So happy you're here. So Alicia say assistant professor in political science. We have two political science professor here with us. That exciting for me.
What an
Um,
interesting time to be a political
yes,
scientist.
Alicia. Yeah. Do you like to say something? Are you
Yeah,
new
I
to
could just introduce
NIU?
myself. I'm an assistant professor in political science, and similarly, I am here because I really like the workshops that the center puts on, and I found them useful. And in particular, I'm just really trying to engage those students, both online and in person, who maybe have been kind of historically lacking engagement, and really just looking for tools to help boost engagement amongst those populations.
Thank you and welcome. Dawn say I am an ASO instructor. Um, in word, language, and culture. I'm gonna be completely ignorant here. What are you ASL?
I'm sorry, you can hear me, right?
Yes.
Yes, ASL, American Sign Language.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Curious more to learn more about including student voices in our learning environment. Yeah, so we have quite a diverse group of faculty here, and I will share with you some of the things that I've done when I teach a large enrollment classroom. And I hope everybody gonna share about what they're doing in their discipline and courses so that we can learn from one another. So a truly balanced class engagement strategy typically promote equity and inclusion by amplifying the voices of all students rather than just the outspoken few. So of course, that doesn't happen by chance, right? It takes intentional and preparation from faculty to cultivate equitable interaction and promote active learning. So the goal for our workshop today is for you to be able um, to to walk away with these four things. Develop norms or guidelines for classroom participation, construct equitable way to call on your student, and then nurture the voices that were historically silent in higher education, um, or nurture the voices that challenge the dominant narrative. And the last thing is how do you equitably assess student participation or engagement? Um, and we have a standalone workshop on equitable grading, and I think a couple of you were in it. So if you want to learn more about equitable way of grading, you can look out for the upcoming workshop from CIDO. So with the first learning objective, develop norm for participation. So typically, it's a good practice to consider goal generate guidelines or norms with your student. So this allows students to take part in establishing the type of participation they wish to have in your classroom. And it also make it easier for you to reinforce the norm and remind students that they created and agreed to this classroom policy. So if you feel like you want them to at least speak up or participate once every class, maybe throw it out there into the norm for class participation and let them discuss. And if they agree on that, then you can reinforce it. So depending on what courses you teach, um, what are considered norm can be relatively different, right? So if you teach a discussion-based social justice education course, you might want to consider challenging some of the common guideline for discussion norm because many of the established guideline reinforce the unequal power dynamic in higher education and in our society. But that's for a different workshop. I teach chemistry. It's hardcore science. We don't discuss or learn about opinions. Our content is driven by evidence-based knowledge. So one of the norm I work very hard to establish in my classroom is to normalize being wrong. So I keep telling my student, is it okay to make mistake? Um, is it normal to make mistake? That's how we learn. So at the beginning of class, after I introduce the learning objective for the day, I often ask a lot of questions to kind of evaluate the student prior knowledge on the objective. And they gave me often wrong responses. And we would have a little celebration. I would say something like, excellent, we're going to learn something new today. If you already know the answer to those questions, you probably shouldn't be here. You should be in upper division classes. Same idea when it comes to homework. I typically give my student unlimited attempt on their homework so that they can correct their initial response and learn from their mistake. And I only record the highest score attempt. Um, the second thing I did were I like to acknowledge and appreciate the effort of those who participating. It takes bravery for one to raise their hand to ask question, even just for clarification, or to answer a question about a complex concept. So as an instructor, I always try to acknowledge and thank students who ask question. And I would say that I'm sure other people have the same question or similar questions. So thank you for stopping me and asking for clarification or explanation or give more example on how to solve an analytical problem, because I'm sure many other students also benefit from it. Um, so for the large enrollment class that I taught up to 200 students, it's very critical for me as an instructor to establish expectation. So what I try to do in the first week of class, and I also have it in my syllabus, is to establish my expectation on being on time, on whether I allow them to use technology or not. I typically do, but we have some guidelines for that. Um, and then I also have expectation about not holding side conversation or only have conversation when it's think peer share time. So establish your expectation. What do you expect of them? And consider establishing your norms and share the norms and your rationale for those norms. Like, why do you have the rule on the first day of class or the first week of class? And consider having students sign a code of conduct stating that they have read and understood the expectation for your class. And it depends, because for us in the chemistry lab, we would do a little safety orientation, and then we have a safety agreement that we make student initial each line and sign it, so that later on we can reinforce the norm. So those are the few things that I did in the chemistry class. I would love to hear from everyone here. What are some basic norms that you use in your class, and how do your students respond to these norms? And if you have not established norm for class engagement, are you planning to do so? And what are some potential challenges you are worrying about? Yeah, please.
Sure. I guess in my in-person undergrad classes, they're pretty small, like 30 to 40 students, and generally participation's like an assessed requirement of the class. But I think I do sort of similar things to you in that I like normalize any question is a good question, any comment reflection is a valuable one. Um, there's less sort of concrete factual there's some dates and so on, but most of what we're talking about is sort of open to interpretation and thinking about causality and so on in the social sciences a little bit differently. So welcoming divergent opinions and different takes on readings or cases we've looked at, and sort of normalizing that any question is a good one. So if you don't understand something, that's a great comment. That counts as participation, and let's discuss, etc. And that's why I try to sort of similarly normalize like being wrong, quote unquote, which is less straightforward in my case, is absolutely part of learning. And chances are, if you're brave enough to say that you're not following something, you're not the only one in the room. So you're doing a service to the class by suggesting that. So that's one thing that I do. And I think similar to you too, in terms of think, pair, share, I try to build in different times where the participation is not just sort of like unidirectional to me, but there's time for participation with your colleagues. So you might not be willing to raise a hand and respond to a question directly in front of 40 people, but when we're in a small group of 3 or paired up with one person, you can gain, your excellent participation score speaking and engaging on the material in those spaces. So those are some things I do.
Yeah, I I'm an introvert and I'm also a multilingual learner of English, so I will not be the one who raised my hand in the whole classroom. So I really appreciate when faculty professor have like think pair share to turn to the person next to you. That's when I actually speak up. And so I'm so glad to hear that you use that practice. Um, anyone else?
I'll hop in, I guess. So I have a handout that I got and adapted a long time ago. I think I actually got it from the then director of the Chance program at NIU, because our students, especially in English 103P, and back then when I got that, I think we still had English 102. So we were really talking about underprepared students needed some guidelines. And so I'll see if I can find a copy and send it to you, but it really stresses things like, listening to other people with an open mind, taking care in the language that you use when you're responding to others. Um, and students are glad of those, because a distressing number of students have had at least one experience of feeling embarrassed or kind of humiliated in a class, especially in high school. And so one of the things we want to do is set college apart as a place for free discussion and free inquiry. And that means listening with what do I want to say, with humaneness, right? Even if somebody is talking about a position that you don't agree with.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. So Kathy, you teach English, right? And then we have two political science faculty here. I want to bring us to the second question. I'm really curious about whether you have classroom norm that challenge dominant narrative. And I'm gonna throw this out here too, that for example, in higher education, it's the liberal ideology is more dominant than conservative ideology, right? And now we see we had just have an election and the whole nation respond to it. I wonder how has that turned out or show up in your classes? Like, um, do you have a way to help students challenge the dominant narrative, and how did that work out for you?
Boy, I feel like everything we do, especially in English 103P, is a challenge to the dominant narrative, including the beginning, invitation to use your own voice in your writing instead of to sound like whatever that awful AP thing that you learned about in high school was all about. And we really emphasize students learning to tell their own stories, and their own stories are inherently counter narratives. I think we're pretty successful in there. I know right after the election, I had a lot of Black students who were just so distressed. And we can say, well, the dominant ideology in higher education is liberal, but not necessarily always at the classroom level, especially at the beginning. And I felt glad that students were able to say things to me like, I couldn't move for a few days after that. I mean, like, the American people won't elect somebody, a Black female to the highest office. And they were just so undone because the reasons to vote for her to them were so apparent. But there were a lot of students around them celebrating. So
Mm.
just talking about their real responses, telling their stories of education, being invited to use their voice, which isn't the voice academically, at least as they've been taught that it is. All of those things are ways of challenging the dominant narrative, I think.
Yeah,
Or maybe
yeah,
creating a new one. We can hope, right? Hope
yeah,
springs eternal.
yeah. Thank you for sharing that. Any of our political science professor want to share?
Sure. I mean, I think I certainly wouldn't couch things in there's a dominant liberal narrative versus some non-dominant conservative narrative that's um, a sort of dynamic of value to focus on. I can speak at least for my courses that sort of the key, most of the students that I'm teaching in international relations courses I teach are not going to become
Mm,
professors of international relations, world historians, advisors to presidents, etc. So exploring sort of the cases of diplomacy making, the causes and the consequences of war, or less so they come out with an encyclopedic knowledge, then exploring the different narratives, or I might use theories or lenses as to how we account for the recurrence of things like violence and genocide, of economic interdependence and underdevelopment, etc. So a lot of what the course is there for is teaching different perspectives,
mm,
quote unquote liberal perspectives, realist perspectives, informed by Marxist perspectives, critical feminist perspectives, etc., to provide different answers for the same or very similar questions. And I think a key thing that I try to do is provide space for a plethora. If you're attached to, um, a traditional liberal lens informed by that Western philosophical tradition, and that's useful to explaining the recurrence of war or the challenge of global governance today, wonderful. If you adhere to a neo-Marxist ideology because class consciousness and hegemony seems more salient to your explanation of these things, also great. If you're not convinced by that and there's a third, also wonderful. So trying to provide spaces in that way, I sort of feel like I immediately push against the let's pause and hear from Republicans, and let's pause and hear from libertarians, and let's pause and hear from the left wing
Oh,
of the
I,
Democratic Party. There's
I
none of
really
that in
hope
my,
nobody does that.
for God's
I'd
sake.
be
Yeah.
slinking
Yeah.
down in my chair.
Yeah. No, I very rarely sense a sort of conservative liberal divide as it plays out in American politics
yeah.
in my classroom, but definitely get people who are animated by, no, there's a really easy way of explaining World War II, and it's this
Mhm.
way. No, 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 you're missing the role of these variables that
Yeah,
this other theory or lens draws
yeah,
attention to. And that's what we spend our time, doing, and trying to get engagement that's thinking critically about that sort of thing. Anyways,
yeah.
that's my thought there.
Yeah, I love that. It's like you provide them a multitude of different viewpoints and perspectives. So it's almost like this question becomes silly because in your classroom there's no such thing as is dominant, right? Because you provide them a myriad of different perspective and viewpoints.
I will just say one thing for the political sides. I mean, we also teach that all of those theories, despite making claims to being sort of anormative, are inherently normative. They're trying to
Mm,
explain things as a way of bettering, of bettering the world. And if you think, some of those will say that sort of that prescriptive component does map onto contemporary
yeah.
politics, right? If the liberal tradition you think is compelling, it's going to tell us we probably shouldn't leave the World Health Organization or elect politicians who would want to do that on day one. That
Mm.
that institutionalized connections are important, and they're
Or
going to
leave the
better.
Paris Accord and similar
Exactly, that
things, right?
multilateral cooperation is worth it. So we get into those weeds, but sort of, I
I
think
think
from a
sometimes students are not as informed about those things as we think. And so there's something inherently counter narrative about inviting them to look outside of the kinds of narratives that they're familiar with, which typically are coming to them on social media, not from like hard news sites or historical
Mhm.
sources or even like higher end journals, that kind of thing. They're getting their sense, and it's hard to say it's a wrong one, right?
Yeah.
But they're getting their sense of things from social media, and those tend to be pretty extreme polar opposite positions. So just inviting them to see other paths is
Mhm.
definitely a new way.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. So now those are great way to start discussion and engagement. Now I want to talk a little bit about the technicality of how we can carry that out. Right. So here are a few strategy for having successful engaging small group discussion or equitable student participation. So invite your students to think about the way they participate. So now is the technicality of it. So do they like to think or talk during class discussion, right? So ask them to think about they tend to participate and ask them to consider make a conscious effort to be mindful of the way they participate and the way others participate. For example, if an individual recognize and acknowledge that they usually talk, then invite them to take a step back and listen instead. And or for individual who usually think and don't talk, invite them to make a conscious effort to participate and talk instead of just stay quiet. So ask student to think about those things. Also, another thing is to ask student to be aware of how our positionality, our social identity, the different identity, whether we self claim or assign to us, then there's nothing we can change about it. So ask students to be aware of how gender, cultural background, socioeconomic status, and life experiences could affect their classmate participation. Um, one thing I keep referring to it being multilingual learner of English. And I use those phrase very intentional. Used to people used to refer to me and other student as what is it, ESL student, English as second language student. So I try to reframe it by saying multilingual learner of English to emphasize that they know a different language. So approach it from an asset minded. So even if you have those students who shy away from verbally participating because they're afraid of their accent, they're afraid of mispronouncing some word and make a fool out of themselves. If you teach the whole class and be very transparent about this, you could encourage those students, the multilingual learner, to participate more verbally and help them understand how that would beneficial to them. Um, and then the last thing is I want to encourage students to realize the difference between intent and impact. So encourage students to assume that their classmates are doing their best. So everybody have a good intent and want everybody else in a class to succeed. However, we must acknowledge the negative impact of individual words or behavior. If it negatively impact the class participation, then we need to acknowledge that and we need to address the behaviors as they arise. So these are just a few things to consider to know the difference between equal versus equality, equitable or intent versus impact, think versus talk. All right. So I'm gonna check the chat real quick. Let's see. Um, Kathy say disciplinary lenses themselves offer various way of sorting and understanding of information at hand. Yes. And then Don say respond, I agree with your choice of term of multilingual. We deal with language learning background and I point out and celebrate multiple language use learning. Thank you, Don, for sharing your perspective. Um, yeah. All right. So moving on to learning objective number two. So how do you um, help student participate? So we're gonna discuss different ways to construct equitable ways to call on student. Um, I feel is essential to manage who's speaking when and who is taking turn in my classroom. I don't want a few loudest or most confident voices to continue to choose when they speak and inadvertently silent the quiet voices, right? So at the same time, we need to be mindful and not silent the voices who are engaged and passionate about a topic specifically, if they come from marginalized voices, or again, it depends on the context on what you're teaching. So what do you consider when you're constructing practical and equitable ways to call on your student? For me, when I teach large enrollment class, I I have to admit I have to use cold calling. It can be an effective way to encourage participation from less vocal student. It can also be an excellent way to bring students who otherwise would not volunteer into the discussion, but I try to be very transparent about this process. So at the beginning of the semester, I would warn my student that I would use cold calling. So everybody need to pay attention and be prepared to be on the spot. It's not perfect, but it worked for a large enrollment class of 200 students. And I'm very intentional about making sure that I call on people in equitable ways. So I'm prepared to deal with awkward silence. I wait for a minute or so after asking the question. And this is where wait time come in. Um, so 1 minute when you're waiting, the awkward silence can be very long. So I one of the simplest strategy that I use to increase time for student to think is to expand and uh, so when I do wait time, I increase time for student to think. I'm also expanding the number of students who would participate verbally. So to lengthen one wait time after you pose a question to the class potentially could um, increase or expand the number of students who would participate in answering your question. Um, an increase in time, it's critical to provide processing time for students who need more sync time. It's also allow more time for introvert student to rally the courage to speak up. So sometimes they know the answer, but because of their personality, they need some time to like they look around, nobody answer, and they feel a little pressure. So now they have the courage to raise their hand and answer the question. In reality, um, it's challenging, but it's something that I try, and I think it's helpful to get more participation from my student. And sometimes wait time may still not be enough for some student to gather thought or muster the confidence to share their thought. I would introduce right time. So many students may need more scaffolding, more instruction and guidance about how to use the time they have given to think. So you could scaffold wait time um, to require students to write down one or two ideas that would capture their initial thoughts on how to answer the question posed. So you ask a question, you give them some wait time, and then you try to scaffold in the wait time by saying, just write down one or two idea that would capture your thought, your initial thought on how to answer that question. So this act of writing may lead students to discover point of confusion or key insight. And in addition, if you collect these paper that they write down one or two idea, this writing can hold student accountable for their thinking in recording their idea, right? Um, so integrating um, wait time, right time, scaffolding help helping them through think through the time that you give them. Another thing is integrating think pair share opportunity during class session. Um, it's have the potential to cultivate classroom equity in multiple ways. It providing individual student with time to verbalize their thoughts about a concept, promoting comparison of ideas among peers, and transforming the nature of the classroom environment to be more participatory. So promoting a collaborative rather than competitive culture in the undergraduate, at least for undergraduate science classes. So increasing wait time, allowing right time, utilizing think pair share can all can also be helpful in ensuring that you have an equitable distribution of calls across gender and racial identity. Um, if there are more male hands up, then perhaps wait for a woman hand to go up and then call on her, or vice versa. Um, and trying to do the same thing with variety of diverse racial identity student. Um, because we want to try to call on to everyone, right? And not just the few confident and vocal one. So when using a variety of ways to encourage student participation, we ensure that the class has an equitable way for every voice to be heard. Let's see. So Dante, I just went to an online symposium and they shared a slide with us, gave each group a slide, and we type our answer discussion point onto the slide. Yeah, so that's a version of the right time, and it's gonna encourage more participation. So the next slide would be for you. Like, how do you call on your student? Um, if you use some practices or strategy, will a couple of you share with the whole group? And or if you have an awkward teachable moment in your classroom, would you share? And or which of the practices that I just mentioned, which one have you tried and how did it work out?
Well,
Kathy.
for me, it depends because like last semester, I had 4 sections of 103P, and those are small classes. They're about 15, which means that any given day there might be any place from 12 to 15. And I kind of don't really need to call on people in those classes. It's very discussion based. And so students really know each other. They feel free to hop in. This semester, I have larger classes and at opposite ends of the spectrum. So in the 400 level classes, before I even get the question out, there's people like, hopping in to answer and joining in. Those two are both synchronous online. So they'll hop in on the chat. I might ask them to hop in on the chat. I will ask them to write stuff and vote on things and all of that. But again, they're really eager to get their perspective across. My other end, the 103s this time have 25 students in them. And what I've been doing there is putting them in smaller groups to discuss things and then having the group report back. That way, everybody gets an opportunity to be involved. And it's not just the students who are more outgoing who
Mhm,
take over discussions.
mhm. Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much for sharing. So in the chat, Don shared that sometime I call on every fourth in a row and make make my way around so that I'm not inadvertently favoring a particular type of student. So this is similar to the cold call. Yeah, it's random call on student to encourage participation. Um, Alicia, I use mainly same strategy but have always struggled with direct calls. Um, I mean, it's not a perfect solution, right? There's always advantage and disadvantage. You just have to do it depend on what class you have and the student personality too. I often you think peer share and small group discussion and then bring into larger class discussion. Yeah, that's one of the practices that have evident that help more participation and more equitable participation. Um, I would say, are you much of what you went over? A note that I never call in the first few week at least. I get to know student before I know who would be comfortable being put on the spot. In the upper year class, I tend to use more uh, an hour a week for group work, getting focused in small group to chat through question, collaborative, read an article, prompt some to engage who might not, others why. Yeah. Yes, for the student. Breakout group is good. I'm not a big fan of calling on student either, but I have to demonstrate language proficiency that can only happen by participating in class. I do U group, but there will be beginner student who are struggle or less engaged with simply let other participate or avoid the activity in the group. Yes, yes. Yeah, so there's so many good ways, right? And um frankly, at some point, I will have to review the literature and see how the call on student work out. If there's evident the way we learn it differently, the way our student communicate these days differently. So at some point, all of that's going to change. Um, the 200 student class now is shrink down to 175 and it's still a lot of student, but that's the introductory level general chemistry course, and yeah, it's always a challenge. Thank you so much for sharing the different practices here that you use. So I hope you maybe consider introduce, if you already introduce wait time, maybe write time, and see if how's that work out for you. Okay, so the number three, so nurture voices that challenge the dominant narratives. Um, so this come from a social justice education point of view or perspective. So if you pay attention to this question of who voices are we hearing and who voices aren't we hearing, and if I think that their voices that we haven't heard from or perspective that we haven't heard from, then I would usually try to prioritize making more time to allow space for those voices and those perspectives that we haven't heard from. So one of the things that we can consider, and again, depend on your context of the course, is to encourage a cultivation of brave spaces instead of just safe spaces in your classroom. So that switch of mindset, being brave rather than being safe, allows students to reflect on their identities and how the identity converge or conflict with the course content. So the way we look, the experiences we have, and the choices we make shape us into who we are today, right? As educator, as lifelong learners, and who we are influence the way we see our student, especially the one who are different from us, racially, ethnically, culturally, or different background, different in experiences. So all of that gonna in a way impact our teach the way we teach, the way we learn, the way we motivate and encourage our students to participate and ultimately to successfully learn in your class. So I hope you consider way you can elevate historically marginalized voices in higher education and in society. Um, maybe pay attention to how much space is someone is taking during class and thinking about how much space that same identity take up in at our institution or in society, and trying to get your student to think about those as well. um, so if you can know your student individually. Ari mentioned that at first you don't call until you know them better. So that's another great strategy and practice to use to encourage participation. Um, and then if you know them, sometime you can meet their participation needs, right? So if the student, instead of if somebody tell you that they prefer to write or prefer to work in smaller group, that's something that you could consider doing. um, Talk to them outside of class, finding out what preventing them from participating in class, and see if it's something that you could compromise or accommodate. um, to get student comfortable speaking in larger group, you might choose to start conversation in smaller group first, which many of you say that's what you do, because it provides a safe environment for students to gain comfort and confidence while testing out their ideas with their peer. And so small group discussion and small group activity can also encourage the quieter student to become more involved, and multiple voices may be empowered, which is good. So be clear about the outcomes you expect from small group work for the time frame allotted. So tell student upfront what you expect they will do within their group, and then where you pick up from and when you bring the conversation back together. So many of these things, it sounded like everybody already utilize and using them in your courses. Don said in the chat, I wonder what this look like in a classroom where I am teaching an oppressed language to member of the oppressing group. It get a little tricky for us. We embrace diversity and highlight members of our community whose identity intersect with our student, but it's a bit tricky to teach our perspective in our classes. Um, Okay, Cassie, interesting point. Does learning the language entail beginning to grasp the oppression? Yeah. Don, would you be comfortable unmute yourself and tell the group a little bit more about the challenge you face?
Well, so as you know, I teach American Sign Language, which is the language used by deaf and hard of hearing individuals, here in the States and in Canada. But in most educational institutions, deaf and hard of hearing students, um, they are um, the first intervention is with speaking and listening, hearing devices and other things like that. And often deaf and hard of hearing children are not exposed to American Sign Language until they demonstrate that they are not successful using other means, which leads to language deprivation. So it's hard to change the perspective uh, where in an environment where they see hearing and listening to be the norm,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
And we use visual means for communication and require visual support. And so that's where it just gets a little bit tricky,
yeah,
and they will take advantage, like they will talk to one another in the classroom where we won't have access to that. Um, so, I mean, it's just something that we're all learning together, I guess.
yeah, yeah. Do you have a way to deal with that challenge?
We do teach some of the history, that has led to these circumstances, and also just regular classroom environment things. Like, for example, oh, our class has to move to a new room because we don't have a visual fire alarm in our room, that sort of thing.
Yeah,
And then they see that, but um, it's just all of what is on the slide is very important. But it's sort of like we have like a different layer to it in our
mhm,
classrooms, I guess.
yeah. I appreciate so much that you being here in this workshop with us because I I may carry marginalized identity as a woman in STEM or a woman of color, but I in a way, my identity as an able body gave me a lot of privilege and so I this is something that I didn't even think about before. So thank you so much for sharing your perspective. It's
Thank
something for
you.
me to look into and think more about. I'm sure your student walk away from your class probably learn a lot more awareness about the challenges that student with hearing impairment face.
Mm, hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah, thank you.
yeah. Thank you for sharing that. So, so Dawn shares some very unique perspective because of the course that she teaches in American Sign Language. I want to ask for other voices here. Can you share with the group how you nurture, well, how do you nurture diverse voices or voices that challenge the dominant narrative? I know Ari, you share the way you did it, which you beautifully. Um, I wonder, did you notice a positive impact um, on your student when you do that practice? And then also, if anybody else have different way that you do to nurture diverse voices in your classroom, please do share. So, Ari, I can be a little more specific. So, when you use your practice, which nurture a lot of different perspective and viewpoint, do you notice that that practice provide a positive impacts on, say, underrepresented ideology or underrepresented minority in terms of attitude and achievement in your field?
I guess the specific sort of focus on different lenses to confront like cases or classes of phenomena we're interested in. Like maybe, but not like immediately. Like what came to mind is, like one of the perspectives we look at in one of the classes is like critical feminist perspectives, sort of
Mhm.
inquiring as to the dearth of women in positions of leadership or questions of political economic development and women as household workers and so on. And sort of like anyways, a little bit of the history of where that thought sort of entered mainstream political science. And like I have had students who like explicitly said, like, I can't believe I'm gonna say this, and I don't know what my dad would think, but it's so compelling, this viewpoint, and it makes so much
Mm,
sense. And like I never thought, and I was thinking of like a white American
yeah.
male student who said that to me. Like he mentioned his dad was a police officer and he lives rurally and he just never thought in that way ever before and like couldn't imagine he would find that perspective sort of a useful, intriguing one to help him understand, politics, quote unquote. So I think in that way, like it opens people's eyes,
Yeah.
whether that is empowering to someone who might have previously seen themselves as like a feminist or women in the classroom who feel empowered by that. I couldn't say quite as directly. I think like the separate issue, and this kind of comes back to more of your strategy, as you were saying, is like getting to know students and understanding how to sort of make a comfortable and inviting and engaging atmosphere
Mhm.
where someone who's really different from me, maybe like a black female student would feel comfortable with a white male instructor, professor, and sort of cultivating and finding different strategies to do that. Maybe my positionality would preclude her being the one who would put her hand up immediately. And so thinking about that, doing more of the think, pair, share, or the breakout groups or other ways of making space and making folks more comfortable engaging.
Yeah.
But I think that's a little bit different than the like substantive lenses approach.
Yeah, but I really appreciate what you share because now I'm gonna have to rephrase my question because I think what the impact of your approach on that student that share that, oh, I never thought about this. It's amazing. It's a positive impact, and that student will go on in whatever position that he might acquire with power. Now he have a lesson to carry with him, right? So thank you for sharing that. Anyone else?
Yeah, so I was going to say I did something different in my 103Ps that I'm replicating in the 103s this time around. You know, the biggest problem we have in those classes is DFW, right? D's, F's,
Mm,
and withdrawals, students not coming, a lot of first generation students. So I started this semester with looking at college student development, like the phases and challenges that they go through. And I actually found a really good website aimed at parents, not students, but useful for students at University of Central Florida that sort of talks about the phases and the main challenges in each year of college. So we took that at the beginning. Then we talked about the longitudinal study we've done in English that shows that the biggest predictor of success
mm,
in composition is showing up in class. And then we just kind of keep that conversation going all semester. And then at the end, my students did small groups and they got to pick their audience and they could choose teachers, new students that would be coming in next year, or parents. It didn't matter to me, but they had to define their audience. And then the goal was to share with those people what they wish they knew
mm,
based on their own experience about that first year of college. And they were so interesting. So they did small groups, they talked about their own experience, they did some research, and then they gave presentations. So one whole presentation, for example, was about what it's like to be a first generation college student during the first semester of your freshman year. And I mean, it was so interesting to hear them talk about it. And by the way, they're giving these during the middle of our first gen week at NIU, and none of them had any idea that it was first gen week at NIU. So just hearing them say what they wish their teachers knew about that first year experience, what would they would tell them that's different than the official
mhm.
propaganda about
Yeah.
being a freshman that they've learned along the way, or letting parents know the ways in which they sometimes inadvertently put pressure on students or don't understand what they're
Mhm.
going through in ways that make it harder for them. So interesting. And it's all their experience, you know, and I just learned so much from it that I'm probably going to do it for a few semesters in a row now.
Yeah, so wonderful. I would love for to pick your brain more about this because I do offer a workshop on supporting first gen student. I hope you attend one of those workshop and we can chat more. Thank you for sharing. I did want that we have 2 minutes left, so I did want to went over the last one really quick. So equitably assess student participation. So I did a workshop on equitable grading. So I just want to mention, and I know Ari were in there. So one of the things that I want you to consider is aligning your assessment with the learner objective and grade by the learner objective. So just like if you have to grade student participation, it's important for you to be mindful of potential bias. Some students may find it difficulty to maintain eye contact or speak up. So there's a lot of different reasons the student may or may not engage in participation. So provide them a myriad of various ways to participate, not just verbally, would be helpful. Um, if you teach seminar class or discussion based class and participation is a necessity, then maybe do some of the small group discussion or think pair share, to basically think about how you would align your grading with the learning objective and grade whether student have acquired the learning objective. That's to ensure you grade the student equitably and not just grading their compliance. So just be mindful about that. And with that, there's the last one is just reflection on what we talked about today. I really enjoyed this discussion. I myself learned a lot. I will send a follow-up email with the slide and the additional resources here for you to review. And you will have my email address, my contact information. So please reach out if you want to discuss more. And thank you so much for being here and improving your teaching and changing lives out there. Enjoy the rest of your day. and stay warm. Bye.